Hi, and welcome to Intermediate Microeconomics. My name is Dr. David Hebert. I am an associate professor here at Aquinas College. Together, what we're going to do is we're going to go through Armen and Alchian's book, Universal Economics. It was just reprinted a couple of years ago, so it's just been a phenomenal read. We will not be going through every single chapter. There are 42 of them in total. This is a 16-week course, so we're going to be going through only a selection of them. But my goal here is to help you understand economics a little bit better so that you can kind of read the rest of this book on your own and understand more about what's going on in the world. As you can see, I am currently wearing a microphone here in my ear, so every now and then I may have to adjust it just to make sure it stays in. Okay, so let's start off with chapter one. So chapter one basically lays the groundwork for, what is economics, right? And I really like the way that the authors start. Okay, so they say, since the discouraging fiasco in the Garden of Eden, all the world has been a place conspicuous in its scarcity of resources, contributing heavily to the abundance of various sorrows and sins. The study of economics deals with this yoke of scarcity and the modes of behavior intended to minimize the pains and maximize the gains of getting along. Behavior which is restricted and channeled, sometimes helpfully and efficiently, but often hurtfully and wastefully by the social ground rules and institutions we adopt and have had imposed on us. So, in other words, economics is all about how do we confront this concept of scarcity and how do we understand that within the context of the rules we face. Okay? So we're concerned with the existence of scarcity, and then we're concerned secondarily with sort of the institutions or the rules within which we live and operate. Okay? So given that scarcity exists, which means we must make what are sometimes difficult and hard decisions about what we're going to do, and that oftentimes what we want to accomplish in our own lives will take the coordinated efforts of thousands, if not millions of people. How do we end up accomplishing this? Now, it'd be really easy to imagine if there was some central person, barking out orders and making sure that everyone did what they were supposed to do every single day. That would make things really easy. We'd just point to that person and be like, hey, they're the ones that make it happen. Okay. But here's my question to you. Have you ever received marching orders from someone, perhaps in the morning or the night before, about what you're supposed to do the following day? Now, maybe you've received marching orders from your boss, perhaps in the form of, what time your shift starts. In my case, what classes I'm going to teach, what time those classes are going to happen. But that's not what we economists mean here. What we mean are the orders to say produce aluminum so that the car manufacturers can produce cars, or to produce wood so that the pencil makers can make pencils. Now, I haven't received any of these orders, but maybe I've just successfully ignored them all my life. Now, the truth, of course, is that these orders don't come because there is nobody to actually give them. So the puzzle we're faced with is how is it that society actually works as well as it does? Right? Sure, there are serious problems in society today, and I don't want to downplay those at all. But if you think about it, almost all of society is working remarkably well at the overwhelming majority of things. Never forget, as I always like to say, you get to poop in perfectly clean water, and you have a slab of glass, which we call a cell phone, right? That if you tap on it a few times, a sandwich will show up at your door. Frankly, this is nothing short of amazing, and I think we should celebrate just how truly wonderful our lives actually are, especially compared to others around the world and other people throughout history. Hey, John Rockefeller, widely regarded as one of the wealthiest people to ever exist in real monetary terms, didn't get to do either of those things. He couldn't just order a Jimmy John's sandwich using his cell phone. He had to actually go either make it himself or, more accurately, hire someone to live in his house and make it for him. And I bet you it didn't get delivered freaky fast either. Now, what are the sources of scarcity? Okay, so the sources of scarcity are basically twofold. Okay, one is that there just is not an infinite amount of anything. Right? We exist in a world that has finite resources. Okay, and so that in and of itself will impose some scarcity constraints. But the second source is other people. Right? Other people want to use those resources for their own desires. Okay, as Milton Friedman used to always say, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Now, for economists, the word free is a four-letter F word, okay, and we generally don't like it, okay? This isn't because we don't like the idea of free things, we don't like the idea of just giving people stuff. That's not it at all, right? We don't like it because it connotes some weird stuff that frankly is just flat out wrong and dangerously misleading. Now, in the context of economics, a good is anything that people want more of, or more accurately, that people prefer more of to less of. Okay, so some obvious examples of this would be things like food. Okay, food is a clear example of something that we want more of instead of less of. Housing, same kind of thing. What about things like cocaine or heroin or alcohol? Are these things goods? Well, in some sense, they're not exactly good for your health, right? So, in that framework, they wouldn't be considered good. But there are people who want more of these things or would prefer more of them to less. And so, for them, they are economic goods. Now, in this case, a free good would be something that is so abundant that no one actually wants more of it. It's hard to think of examples of this. Air is pretty much the only one I can think of, but even air is scarce to, for example, an astronaut in space or a deep sea diver underwater. We can also think of clean air as being a scarce resource because in California, for example, there is a lot of smog and it gets trapped there. And so having access to clean air would be something that people would generally want more of to less of. What this highlights is two important aspects. One is that costs are subjective. They are only interpreted by the person who actually is bearing them. And second is that costs are context specific. You and I, or me in the context of being in my office right now, I can breathe in clean air without really thinking about it. Perfectly fine. Other people, however, in different settings, can't do that. The astronaut who runs out of oxygen in space is going to have a hard time. Okay. Now we'll return a little bit later to this in a later class to talk more about these last 2 points. Now, free does not necessarily mean, or does not at all, is not the same thing as zero price. Okay? Just because something costs $0 does not make it a free good. For example, driving on the highway doesn't really cost you anything. And yet, I'm sure you've been stuck in a traffic jam at some point in your life, or wished that there were perhaps a faster, more direct route for you to take to get to where you're going. To economists, we would say that you want more roads, either in the form of more lanes so that traffic is reduced, or in the form of more actual roads so that you could take a more direct route to where you're going. So even though driving on the road is for the most part zero priced, roads aren't free because you would prefer to have more of them in one form or another. So goods, one more time, is often used in a misleading way, right? Food, obviously a good. Heroin, for people who use heroin, which I'm going to advocate that you shouldn't, but for people who do, it's a good. right? They want more of it. They would prefer more to less and are oftentimes willing to incur massive costs to try to get more. Okay? Let's move on from the concept of goods, free, and everything there, and let's instead start talking about self-interest. Now, economists often say that people are self-interested. And what we do when we say this is we are not saying that people are greedy or selfish. So what do economists mean? Okay? Self-interest, as the concept is used in economics, means that you want more power to control resources, whether for your own or someone else's benefit. Now, oftentimes we engage in market transactions with other people with no intent of helping others. For example, I teach economics primarily because I love talking about economics, and the school pays me. If the school stopped paying me, I would stop teaching economics. At best, the fact that learning happens is perhaps tertiary, though really the more that I think about it, it's probably secondary. And even if the school did stop paying me, I probably would still do it, but I would certainly do less of it. Okay. Now, sometimes we help other people intentionally. So the idea of the Good Samaritan is true. Samaritan. I am terrible at spelling, so I apologize for that. Okay, so the Good Samaritan is a real thing, and we'd be foolish to deny it. So, for example, the other day I drove past a little boy who was on his bicycle, and he was clearly lost and scared and crying, and it was cold and snowing, right? Because we're here in Michigan. And so I wasn't wearing a coat, I didn't have a hat, right? But I still parked my car, got out, and tried to help him find his mom and dad. Okay, it turned into a whole adventure. I saw more of downtown, or more of the neighborhood rather than I've ever seen in my life. But eventually, we did find his parents, and they were very appreciative. Okay, they didn't pay me for it. The dad actually didn't even really thank me. He kind of just like took the kid and was like, "Yeah, I got it from here," right? So why did I do that? Well, I got those warm, fuzzy feelings of having done the right thing. Okay? And those warm, fuzzy feelings are true. They are a benefit that we feel for doing something that is good. So economics doesn't presume that people have to be paid to do anything, right? It's why, for example, I teach instead of working in the private sector. Okay? So we don't have to be greedy or selfish. We can be good Samaritans. And the other side of this is that we're not driven exclusively by money. Yes, money is certainly a component, and as we say, ceteris paribus, more money will get people to do things more than less money will, but it's not the only motivating factor. Okay? On the other side, we can think of it this way. Clearly, I got benefit from helping the little boy find his family. Does that mean that I'm going to drive around my neighborhood all day, every single day, looking for lost children and trying to help them reunite with their families? Of course not, right? I'm not going to do that. And it will be weird to expect anyone to do so, okay? Now, the fact is, though, that in the right institutional settings, us acting purely in our own self interest ends up with us acting as if we were being good Samaritans for society. So, as I said before, I teach economics because I like talking about economics and because I get paid to do so, right? In other words, given the institutional setting that we find ourselves in, the best way for me to help myself is by providing a service to others. Let that sink in for a minute. Even if it were the case that I didn't care about you as students at all, which is not true, but even if it were the case, I would be led to behave as if I cared about you through my own self interest, right? Because it is the way in which I can advance my self interest is by serving you. The same can be said about almost everyone in society. Now, there are exceptions to this. Thieves are an obvious one, They advance their self-interest by redistributing money or resources from others and to themselves in an involuntary way. There are other exceptions to this than just thieves, but they are much, much less obvious and pernicious than you're probably thinking at this point. Okay, so because scarcity exists, right, which means that not everyone is going to get everything, right, or is more accurately, not everyone is going to be able to fully satisfy all of their wants. There's going to be some form of competition. Okay, but what form will that competition take? Right now, there are several ways in which we could compete. So let's just use an example that's probably familiar to most of you. Let's talk about college campus parking. On-campus parking. Now, if you're like most schools, your campus has more students than parking spaces. So how do we figure out which students are going to get parking spaces and which ones aren't? Okay, so let's say we'll do Aquinas College, for example. We have, let's say, approximately 2,000 students, and we have approximately, I'm just going to guess, let's say 1,000 parking spaces. I should find the exact numbers. Okay, which means that 1 in 2 or half of the students are not going to be able to get a parking space. And this is ignoring faculty parking spaces as well. Okay, so how do we decide who gets a parking space? Well, one way we could do it is through violence, right? Instead of charging prices or anything like that, we could just do violence, right? Whoever wins a big fight gets to have the parking space. This is the familiar mantra that might makes right. Now, maybe we could have a demolition derby, right? We could have each other fight at the beginning of the semester, Thunderdome style, right? Two men enter, only one will remain, and we just do that for everyone on campus. And whoever wins their fight gets a parking space. What do you think about that? Okay. Now, there's pretty much no denial that violence is used as a means of acquiring scarce resources in this world. Thieves are an obvious example, as they take something from you without your consent, often with the threat of violence hanging overhead. But what about governments? Have you ever tried to just, not pay your taxes? Or perhaps have you ever tried to speed away from a cop who has pulled you over? What do you think is going to happen? I'm willing to bet that you'd be met with violence, at least eventually. Because of this, it's often said that governments jealously guard the power of violence through the legal system. In other words, governments strive to maintain a monopoly on what we could call legalized violence. What about some form of discrimination? Okay. Now, I use that word intentionally, mostly to combat the connotations that it has in today's world. Discrimination is really just another word for choice. Okay, so whenever we are choosing, we are discriminating against the alternative options. Okay, now let's apply this to the parking space problem above. How can the college discriminate, or in other words, decide who gets parking spaces? Well, one method we could use would be sort of a first come, whoops, first served. Okay, so we can have a first come, first served, right? So, what sort of discrimination would this like, or what sort of competition would this form of discrimination likely engender or lead to? Well, on the one hand, it wouldn't cost anything to park on campus, right? So that seems like a win. On the other, though, it would now be a race to get to campus early so that you could get a parking spot. This would privilege people who take morning classes, but would discriminate against people who take classes at perhaps more sensible times. As a quick aside, we actually do have a system like this, and most college campuses in this country have a system very similar to this. Of the people who are allowed to park on campus, the spots are often given on a first come, first served basis. This is in part why I almost always will teach an 8 a.m. class, because then I get here before everyone else and I can get a very good parking spot. It's also why I am reluctant to go home for lunch at lunchtime, because as soon as I leave, my parking spot will be taken and I will have to park much further from my office. Okay? So we could use a first come, first serve basis, and that's going to privilege some people over others. Alternatively, we could try to decide based on merit, or we could also think about most deserving. Okay, so this sounds somewhat intuitive, but when we peel back the layers, it starts to sound a little bit untenable. Some forms of this type of discrimination are pretty obvious, right? For example, handicap parking spots, right? It seems very clear that based on the merit or deserving or need criteria, people who have physical disabilities that preclude them from being able to walk, significant distances should probably get spots that are closer to the doors. Okay, so that seems to make sense. But given our problem that we have 1,000 parking spaces, I feel pretty confident that Aquinas College doesn't have 1,000 people who qualify for disability parking. Okay, and so how would we allocate the remaining spots? Well, maybe, and in doing so, we'd have to figure out how we were going to define what most deserving or merit actually means. So maybe we could use grades, right? So the higher your GPA, the more likely you are to get a spot on campus. We could instead use how far you live from campus. So if someone lives, say, an hour away and they drive in every single day, they're probably going to need or want, at the very least, a spot that's close to the door, right? Because they've traveled a long distance already. Perhaps we could use what major you've decided to study in, right? So maybe the English majors get to have priority over, let's say, the business majors. Maybe we could use family size. So if you're from a larger family, we give you a closer or better parking spot. Or maybe we could use income level. And there's a ton of different metrics by which we could try to classify most deserving. But what about a rich student who is failing their classes but lives really far away? Should we award them a parking spot while the student from a low income household who is doing well but lives only 15 minutes from campus should instead? Who should get that spot? And what if the income levels were reversed? Would that change your decision? A second thing to think about with this based on merit or most deserving is who gets to decide what the decision rules are going to be. In other words, who gets to define merit or most deserving? I might have a very different definition of merit or most deserving than, for example, the provost or the president or an English professor. Right? Could the person who gets to decide this sort of decision or make this sort of decision or this criteria, could they perhaps use that power to privilege people that they like more than people that they don't like? That might be something that we wish to avoid. So, what we're trying to get at here is that this notion of competition is omnipresent. Okay? Given scarcity, competition will always exist. The question, whoops, there we are. The question that we want to ask and that economists are always interested in are twofold. One would be what forms of competition will there be or will there likely to be? And two, what will be the result of that competition or what will be the likely result? Now, what we're after is a form of competition that accomplishes a few goals. Okay? So one, we want this competition to lead to people serving others. Okay? In this capacity, we want to align people's incentives such that they compete with one another to do more for other people at the same cost, or to do the same amount of good or benefit for someone else at a lower cost. If we could pull that off, then what we have is a society that rewards service to others. Okay? Now, that sounds to me like a win win.